So I am going to begin by thanking Lindsay McGrath and Mary Giles and the staff of the Alumni Relations Office putting this together for us today. We're really very grateful to be here. I'm joined here today at the Meridian's office by another Smith alum, our new editorial office manager, Ali Einbinder, who has been with Meridian since the fall of last year. Ali, do you want to say a word about who you are before I introduce myself further?
Sure. I'm from the class of 2010. I was a sociology and study of women and gender double major, and I love working at Meridian's. It's right in line with my academic interests, so I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you, Ali. And I'm really pleased to have Ali working alongside me and acting as the anchor, actually, at Meridian's. So thank you. We're also joined by some of our interns who have been working at the Journal this year. They are not visible on screen, but I'll just name them very quickly, if I may. Nelida Ayala, who's a graduating senior. Rebecca Connor, who's a sophomore. Saturn, I'm forgetting Sally's name, so Jones, right? Johnson, who is a sophomore also, and Alice Tan, and who also have contributed to the work we're doing in the webinar, but are very much contributing to our work at Meridian's. And you can see them all on our website, by the way, if you want to know a little bit more about them. So as Lindsay mentioned, I am an alum of Smith College, class of 1990. In fact, I lived at Parsons House, which I can see from the window of our Meridian's conference room, which is where I'm zooming into you from. I came to Smith as an intended English major because I wanted to be a journalist, and ended up graduating as an economics major with a public policy minor, because I realized that actually the interests I had were with questions of power and advantages and disadvantages in US society, and that the sociology major was more in line for me with answering those questions. And just for my alums who would want to know, in addition to Parsons, I also lived at Sessions House, which we can see from our front door here at Meridian's, and the Friedman House next door, because this is actually called Henshaw, but it used to be called the Friedman Apartments for the Smithies who are watching. So basically, much of my life at Smith has taken place in the quadrant that surrounds the current Meridian's office. Along those lines, by the way, I'm also really pleased to announce here for the first time publicly that we will be moving from this space at 18 Henshaw to 22 Green Street and having a grand opening of that location in September of this year. We are very excited about that. It is very much of a piece with the way that Meridian's is growing and becoming increasingly visible on campus. So if you happen to be in the area at the time, come by and see us, please. So from Smith, I went on to graduate school at the City University of New York Graduate Center, where I took a degree in sociology with a focus on Dominican racial identity, specifically as it relates to questions of Blackness and anti-Blackness, both in the Dominican Republic and in diaspora, and returned to Smith as a pre-doctoral Mendenhall Dissertation Fellow, which some of you may recall is a 5-college fellowship program that was meant to support the work of faculty of color, to bring them into the Valley, or in many of our cases back to the Valley, to join the faculties of one of the 5 colleges. In my case, I arrived back at Smith just at the moment when a group of Smith faculty were conferring with Ruth Simmons, our president at the time, about the possibility of establishing a journal that was a women's studies journal, but went beyond the work that the existing women's studies journals of the time were doing, in that it would center what we now call intersectionality. And those faculty members were Susan Van Dyne, the founder of what was then the Women's Studies program, is now the Study of Women and Gender program. Nancy Saporta Sternbach, who was actually my professor at Smith, Spanish professor, but one of the founders of Latin American and Latino studies. Elizabeth Alexander, who is the founder of the Poetry Center at Smith, and some of you may know is the current president of the Mellon Foundation, was also the poet laureate and the poet for the inauguration of the Obama presidency, and a handful of others. Anne Arnett Ferguson from what was Afro-American Studies at the time, now called Africana, as well as others from anthropology, political science, government, etc. That group of feminist scholars at Smith approached Ruth with the idea of establishing a journal at Smith College that would center the voices of women of color. This was an exceptional and radical move in many ways because, again, as you may know, most scholarly journals are established and administered at R1 research institutions, whether public or private, because they require a tremendous amount of resources and of scholarly support. So it was really, truly exceptional that this group of faculty and that President Simmons saw Smith as a place that could not only house this project, but launch it and sustain it over the next several decades. And it is to their credit that they had that vision. As I said, I happened to be here as a Mendenhall Dissertation Fellow when that conversation was wrapping up, and Ruth was, in fact, authorizing the establishment of the journal. So it's perhaps no surprise that Susan Van Dyne approached me as I was still in the full throes of writing a dissertation to ask me if I would consider submitting one of the chapters I was working on, which had to do with hair as a central part of Dominican racial identity, expression and formation, to the journal. I was not prepared to submit an essay to a scholarly peer-reviewed journal, but one does not say no to Susan Van Dyne, again, as some of you may know, especially when she sends Nancy Supporta Stern back after her to ask again. So I went ahead and took a chance, sent the essay out to them, and they submitted it to a double-blind peer review process, which is what Meridians does and has always done, because it manages to walk the line between hewing to the gold standard of the US Academy, which is double-blind peer review. In other words, the author doesn't know who the reviewers are, the reviewer doesn't know who the author is, in order to ensure that the work is getting the most rigorous kind of feedback and critique possible. This is really important in a historically white-serving, male supremacist US Academy, because we do not want the work to be valued by that institution as being somehow less than other work. So my article, like everything that comes through Meridians, was subjected to that. And much to my great surprise and pleasure, it was accepted and published in volume 1, number 1. And it is truly an honor for me that that was the case. And that is what began my relationship to Meridians, was as an author, going through the peer review process with the journal and with the kind of mentoring and critical feedback that makes Meridians really, truly exceptional. So Ruth Simmons, whose quote, by the way, we have on all our materials, noted that women of color have many histories, and these histories can be brought into full and useful relief by providing opportunities for these women to speak for themselves. And that was certainly my experience. And it is the ethos with which I was proud to assume the role of editor in 2017. Between my position as an author for Meridians, I was then invited to join the editorial advisory board as soon as I was hired onto the faculty, which happened the year after my predoctoral fellowship. And as Lindsay said, I've been a faculty member in sociology, Latin American Latino studies, and the study of women and gender since then. An editorial advisory board member from 2000 to 2017, and then was approached by the existing board while I was out of the room in the Dominican Republic about assuming the editorship from Paula Giddings, who was our longest serving illustrious editor from 2005 to 2017. So I stepped into that role at that point. Before I turn to introducing my co-panelists today, who are all award winners, whose work really exemplifies the very best of what is already excellent work in Meridians, I wanted to point all our guests to the Meridians website, which Lindsay is going to do us the favor of pulling up for us, to ask you all, if you haven't already, to please subscribe either or also to our journal, to our newsletter, and to our new issue alert, so that you can remain informed about what we are doing and publishing here at Meridians and at Meridians at Smith. And if you do that today, not to sound like a salesperson, but I have to honor my entrepreneurial mom, who very much would have done this, we will send you a lovely Meridians tumbler, or a glass mug, or our original black and purple mug, or our newly designed Meridians t-shirt, which was designed by our current student intern, Saturn Johnson, who is quite talented. So if you sign up during today's webinar, we'll make sure to send you one of those lovely Meridian swag items. So please take a moment and also go look through our website. There's so much there that will give you a sense of what we're doing and what we have been doing. Thank you, Lindsay. The website will also offer you a fuller explanation of the 2 awards that are being represented here today, but I'll give you a brief introduction to them. In order to honor Paula J. Giddings, who was not only editor of Meridians, but as many of you may know, one of the founders of Black women's studies and history in the United States, and a wonderful colleague at Smith and a mentor to me in this role, I established the Paula J. Giddings Best Article Award in 2018. That award is juried by our editorial advisory board, which reads the previous year's volume, both issues, and votes on a rank order system for what they consider to be the most outstanding of an already outstanding group of pieces. And this year, the winners are, we have an awardee who won the full prize, Sandra Ruiz, who joins us today from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And as is often the case, because there's so much excellence, we also wanted to award 2 other authors, Asle Zenglin from also the same issue as Sandra, which is the Feminist Mornings issue published in the fall of 2022. And Jennifer J. Williams, whose piece came out in the issue that I curated in-house in the spring of 2022 that involves Black feminisms in the Caribbean and the United States. This special issue was focused on feminist mornings, and it was guest edited by Kimberly Juanita Jones of Dartmouth University and our colleague at Simmons University, who I'm blanking on, Jyoti Puri, excuse me, I had a menopause brain moment there. So it is my great pleasure to introduce those 3 scholars who will tell us a little bit about their work and engage in conversation. Let me also let you know that joining us today are the 2 winners of the Elizabeth Alexander Best Creative Writing Award. This award was established in 2019 to honor Elizabeth Alexander's central role in establishing the journal, and in the fact that one of the things among many that makes Meridians exceptional is that from the beginning, it has included creative writing as a form of women of color feminist knowledge production that has been part and parcel of our mission, as well as of art, visual art, and art of various kinds, 3-dimensional, et cetera, to live alongside and in conversation with more conventional research-based scholarship. This award, unlike the Paula J. Giddings Award, is an open submission award. This year we had the largest number of submissions in the previous 4 years that the award has been given. It is a double-blind juried award that is bestowed by our Creative Writing Advisory Board based on the submissions. In other words, neither the board, the awardees, I guess, could look up who our board is, but the board did not know who the submitters were. And based on this very large pool of excellent work, selected a winner for poetry, Yeli Sawida Kamara, who won for poetry, and in a big surprise to us, after we looked to see who the author was, a current Smith student, graduating senior, Cece Roth Eagle, who won for prose. So that was a big surprise. We didn't expect it. We're very pleased that Cece went ahead and submitted the work for our consideration, and we're very pleased that she was a winner. It was not an inside job. That's all I want to make sure to say. It was totally a surprise. So now I'm going to turn it over to our awardees, and I'm going to ask each of you, beginning with Sandra, please, to tell us where in the world you're zooming in from, share the title of your work, and a brief summary of the work that was bestowed the Paula J. Giddings Award.
Thank you so much, Janetta, and it's a real honor and privilege to be here with all of the exceptional writers and poets. So it's with great honor that I am allowed to speak right now and be in company with all of you. I am Sandra Ruiz. I'm an associate professor in the departments of English and theater at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Aside from writing what we would call, I guess, I don't know, more theoretical texts such as Reconness and co-writing with formless formation with the wonderful Hypatia Verlumis, I'm also a poet, a curator, and a producer, and I spend a lot of my time working with students and community members through minoritarian aesthetic initiatives, which is quite dear to my heart. So this book, I mean, this article in particular is part of a book called Tears for Tears, Aesthetics and Grief Minor, which will be published with NYU Press, which really highlights the stunning work of Black and brown queer feminist artists that are really asking us to think about grief work as intentional labor and intentional politics that does not dissolve this kind of binaristic relationship between death and life, but instead works to animate graveyards or to think about the way in which the dead is never dead. And so this piece in particular, A Light for a Light, Minoritarian Aesthetics and the Politics of Grief Work, really highlights the work of two incredible artists. I'm sure I'm biased, and I think that they're here today, but it's Eva Margarita, an incredible Afro-Latinx performance artist and scholar in her own right. And in this piece, Eva pushes us to really think about accompaniment, what it means to think with the dead and to think with loss, and engages in consuming her father's ashes as an ancestral practice. And so part of that allowed me then to write about my a Puerto Rican funeral rite, my own father's passing, and then to think really critically with Pedro Lopez, who this Boricua queer multimedia artist and activist who attempts to counter the catastrophic across Puerto Rico and the Rican diaspora by creating these really beautiful stone tear basins across public sites in New York City as a way to stage communal sites for crying together. So I want to take this moment not only to say that this piece was written, I don't think we ever write about artists. I think we are lucky enough that they allow us to write with them. And so part of doing this type of work means that Eva and Pedro, whom I love quite dearly, also wrote this piece, right? Even if it's in kind of an energy of spiritual domain or immaterial energies that are traveling across the pages. And I want to say that it was really hard to get this piece published precisely because it does not abide by conventional colonial standards of writing and thinking. But Kimberly Juanita Brown and Joety Puri, especially Joety, really tenderly took this piece and said, we want it. We think it has a home. It's okay, you're a little different. And Meridians might be the place that will allow you to kind of challenge the foreclosures of academic writing and thinking. So I'm really grateful for that. I've spoken enough.
Thank you so much, Sandra. I really appreciate that. I think I'll pass it over to Jay Williams.
Good morning and afternoon, maybe, to people in other places in the world. I'm Jay Williams. I'm currently at an assistant professor at the, where do I work? Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, California. One of the reasons why I'm thrown off is because California normally is warm and it has been raining and horrible. And I can't walk my dog because there are rivers in the street. But ultimately for this work, I kind of realized I've been writing it a really long time because a lot of the stuff is coming out in 2016 and then writing it since then to finally have it published was kind of a lot, and thank you. So my work is apologizing to shavers, Black Girl Magic's resilience discourse, and the fear of melancholy Black femme digital subjectivity. And ultimately, I was trying to, I guess, even feel within myself why I didn't quite get the hype over Black Girl Magic. And at least for those who know, those who are a part of it, everyone thought Black Girl Magic was like the best thing happening on social media for a really long time, and to some still into the present. However, this kind of popularized Black femme subjectivity wasn't necessarily widely accepted by particularly folks who are disabled in some fashions, or just had a kind of like different relationship to pretty images of Black women across the internet. And so particularly there was Linda Shavers, who actually we were in the same place at the same time and never met each other at Temple University, where I did my graduate work. But they had written an article during that time saying that they had a problem with Black Girl Magic. And while you would think in a normal idea of sisterhood that everyone would be like, this is a okay representation and we should take it, actually a lot of attacks happened to her, and essentially before we kind of popularized the term, she was essentially canceled for her negative reaction to Black Girl Magic. And in this, I write about this and connect it to these ideas of what does it mean to be melancholy Black woman. And we so much come up to this idea of we have to be resilient, or at least we have to publicly show Black resilience as the main kind of like presentation of what it means to be Black and femme. But how do we, or is it possible for Africana people to reclaim that, to not be part of that kind of narrative, and instead have the wholeness of our experience, even when we're sad, depressed, and broken? And so ultimately, one last thing, criticizing this from a social media framework, this being kind of like the language of how we're having public discourse these days. And so to see both a cancellation happening that challenges what it means to speak about our existence, really wanting to get at those kind of like digital moments and how much the digital is impacting kind of our actual experience. And so with the same thing, I wasn't sure exactly where this fits. My training is in Africana studies, strictly so, and let me say a very not gender analysis version of Africana studies, which still happens these days. And so to be told about the interdisciplinarity, but not necessarily accepted within certain areas, I really wanted to like reframe this as talking about women's experiences in a really deep, different way. And so I think my colleague at work was like, what about meridians? And I was like, sure. I've seen some stuff in there I really like, and I didn't know that I would, I guess, be accepted there. But then I appreciate that this happened, as well as the recognition of this work as being seen as valid is very helpful. Thanks.
And then some, Jay. Thank you. Astrid.
Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you so much for this award. I'm honored to receive Paula Giddens' honorable mention for the Best Article Award. And it's also great to be in conversation with you all and learn from all of you. I am an assistant professor in Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Rutgers University. Until I landed at Rutgers, it took a while from city to city. So changing so many institutions. And I'm from Turkey originally, and I did my undergrad and master's in Turkey. And Janetta, we shared a major. I am an economics undergrad, and I switched my career plans, and I just moved on to sociological training. Then moved to anthropology department at the University of Toronto with a collaborative program in women, gender, and sexuality studies. Then I did a few postdocs at Brandeis, Harvard, and Brown, then eventually got the permanent position at Rutgers. So I did publish a book in Turkish before based on sex work in Turkey, and basically interrogating the legal and medical line between licensed and unlicensed sex workers in Turkey, and how the state was taking a kind of sexual form through drawing this line through its institutions. Now my second book, my actual English book, is going to be published early 2024, and it's called Violent Intimacies, the Trans Everyday and the Making of an Urban World. It's going to be published by Duke University Press. So this particular piece, which is titled Caring for the Dead, Corpse Washers, Touch and Mourning in Contemporary Turkey, is actually a product from my book manuscript. I spent so much time with trans communities and the struggles around funerals and ritual rites. And so in this particular piece, I'm focusing on the care work for the dead to discuss the relationship between death, mourning, care, and sex and gendered embodiment in Turkey. By care work for the dead, I mean the preparation of the deceased body for burial according to the dominant religious framework, which is Sunni Islam. And Sunni Islam requires strictly gendered sex burial practices and mourning rituals, including the coffin design, the prayers at the mosque, the washing ritual, and the burial itself. And these practices are different for women and men. So while preparing the deceased for the burial, the washing ritual is a particularly intimate feature of the care work, as it involves nakedness and transgression of some established boundaries of the social body. The body is washed and wrapped in a white shroud for inhumation. So I was most interested in talking to people who did this washing ritual, including corpse washers, family members, friends, or the loved ones of the deceased person. And I was wondering how they felt about this particular ritual, how they decided to participate in, how they mourn through this washing practice itself. So I tried to bring the senses, the sensorial aspect of mourning, other than orality. My main focus was about touch, and how touch itself and tactility could be an alternative mode of mourning, how people would be using their bodies or their proximities to the deceased body to mourn in alternative ways. And what was interesting in the research itself, this particular form of mourning was denied to certain people who had sex transgressive bodies, trans people, some queer people, or sex workers. So the whole burial space opened up a site for contestation about claims to the body, who can mourn, who is grievable, who is not ungrievable, quoting Judith Butler here. So I have been also interested in the productive side of that, like what it means to think about that not as an ending, but as a kind of space that we can just think about political struggles, imagination about future lives, a different kind of world, so as to just, to live together. So yeah, this is actually the summary of my paper, I would say. And Meridians was a particularly good address for this piece. And I want to also echo my thanks to Jyoti Puri and Kimberly Juanita Brown for inviting me to join their special issue, and which is a fascinating issue. I just recommend highly to everyone to actually download the individual articles and read them all. And Meridian's intersectional and transnational approach strongly resonates with my framings and analysis of this paper through bringing together religion, gender, death, mourning in a Muslim majority context in the global South, and also its emphasis on the particularities of historical, social, and political formations has made the Meridians the right address for the publication of this particular piece. And also the readership profile is very important. I know that readers are keen on following the emerging issues, feminist issues, and questions produced by women of color scholars, artists, and activists. So it was also my desired and targeted readership, I would say.
Thank you, Aslet. Thank you very much. And I think that's a good segue to Yaeli, whose work very much deals with questions of haptic grace. So Yaeli, would you tell us about your piece? And I've also asked you to actually read your award-winning poem for us.
Thank you so much, Professor Candelario, as well as the Meridian's editorial board and fellow awardees and audience. Lindsay and Ali, also, thank you so much for this opportunity. It's really a pleasure to be here with you today. My name is Yaeli Suida Kamara. I'm the current Poet Laureate of Cincinnati, Ohio, as well as incoming faculty member at the Department of English at Xavier University this fall. And it's just an honor to be here. And what I will say about American Beach, it's a poem that's thinking about how we can dignify each other through gentle and intentional and attentive acknowledgement of each other's presences in space. And it was really chronicling a moment or thinking about and celebrating a moment where a stranger became kin or family in a moment's notice. And I wanted to honor just the ways that people can transform, strangers can transform into sisters. And there's something very divine and miraculous about that. And I wanted to capture that. And I remember writing this poem in January of 2020, February of 2020. And one of my closest friends from college was visiting me from New York City. And I was like, let me read you this poem. And I think it's the last time I've seen her since the pandemic had started. And so this was I think it was the last poem I wrote before the pandemic started. And so there's something, I did not cause the pandemic with this poem, but it's something that really marked the moment. And I'm grateful to live a life where I saw the importance of human touch before the pandemic, and grateful to be here and continue to celebrate that. And so before I read the poem, I wanted to say something about meridians. So I'm really happy again to be here thinking about full circle moments. My dear friend, mentor, and colleague, Michael Martins, is here in the chat from Bloomington, Indiana. And before I started my PhD program, he gave me a stack of Meridians journals. And it was like, this is the gold standard. And this is a place that will accept critical and creative work and don't feel like you need to be in one place or the other. The most important thing is the message and honoring your voice and being in conversation and learning from those around you. And so it's wonderful to have him here. And those are among the first books I put on my bookshelf when I was building my my critical and creative bookshelf in Cincinnati. So it means a lot to be here. And I've been thinking about the Meridians journal for a very long time, as well as learning about the Elizabeth Alexander Creative Writing Award. I heard about it a while ago, but I was like, I want to send them my best work. So I waited about a year or two before I sent off the work. So again, it feels wonderful to be here. And I'll just go ahead and I'll read my poem, American Beach. American Beach. I don't mind when she approaches me, a stranger on North Walnut Street, who only tells me about what she sees while reaching 2 fingers in to retrieve it from my hair. She squints a bit, fights the menace of hot silver Hoosier sun, and relieves me of a problem that for her rests too close to me. A deep plunge into my curls. I wait to see how far she goes, and because I miss the hands of the women I know, I think I'd even let her hook her unfamiliar fingers into the lace of my wig, but she stops short of me feeling completely like home. It is an American Beach leaf, green as opposite of red. She pulls this weightless raft from inside the crown of me. In small town, downtown, there is a woman who does not know my name, but calls herself my mirror, haptic grace. She holds the leaf to my face, then releases it to flow slowly down the vertical river of air to the pewter concrete. I don't mind when she approaches me, a stranger on North Walnut Street, taking a leaf, leaving her fingerprints to sing and sing and sing so close to our skin until I hear my own voice say, I feel you too. How mighty, the God portal of human touch.
Thank you so much for reading it, Yaeli. It's so lovely to hear it in your own voice as opposed to in my head. So thank you for that. I want to say also for everyone in the room that Yaeli's poem will be coming out in our fall issue. which is called a mosaic issue curated in-house. And as serendipity would have it, really completely resonates with that issue. In fact, I think I wrote it somewhere here, that about this poem, the fall 2023 issue, Mosaic, is comprised of submissions which bring together work focused on Afghanistan, Canada, Haiti, India, Mexico, Tunisia, Turkey, Sri Lanka, Puerto Rico, and the United States mainland. And reveals the broader picture of the complex, contradictory, and challenging nature of enacting transnational or intersectional feminist solidarities within and across borders, whether physical and embodied, political, ethno-racial, or ideological. And as I wrote in the introduction, I find American Beach's final lines particularly apt final words for this issue, which was curated with the faith that putting widely disparate pieces together with one another would yield something beautiful. How mighty the God portal of human touch, Kamara muses. I agree. When we are touched by another's inherent grace, when we bring our broken fragments into contact, we create the possibility of experiencing the divine mosaic that is humanity in its most authentic form. So thank you, Yeli, for that, truly. Also, Yeli will be our poet in residence, Meridian's first poet in residence in the fall semester, coinciding with our Atilia Cromwell Day celebration here at Smith. And we very much look forward to welcoming you in person. So now it's my honor to turn us over to last, but certainly not least, our Elizabeth Alexander Creative Writing Award winner for prose, Cece, whose prose piece will appear in the spring 2024 issue, which is devoted to Indigenous feminisms across the world and is co-guest edited with Bashuli Deb. The Creative Writing Advisory Board described Month of Wind and Mes de Viento as a masterful blend of narrative with scholarly power, emblematic of the work that Meridian strives to publish. For my part, I was especially struck by the clarity of your reflexivity as a young woman from the United States working and learning from this Mapuche community in Argentina entailed. At one point, you were asked by the Mapuche Consejo Intercultural de Comanejo board member whether you are following what is transpiring during a board meeting. You write, quote, "Entiendo todo," I assure her, even as I, an outsider with questionable language comprehension, even if I'm not entirely certain that I am telling the truth. Cece, would you please read a brief selection from this Mes de Viento and reflect on how your identity as and US citizenship informed your writing about these experiences? And I would say also your Smith education.
Thank you so much. And first I want to say just thanks to all of you on the panel and everyone tuning in. It has been such an honor to be amongst such scholarship, and reading your essays and the poem beforehand is just, I was blown away to be amongst you. So thank you. So to introduce myself a little, my name is Cece Roth-Eagle. I just completed my undergraduate education in the fall, in December, and then I'm walking at Smith in May. At Smith, for all the alums out there, I lived in Wilson House and then Tenney, which was the vegan co-op. I was the captain of the Ultimate Frisbee team and was the head of a literary arts magazine called Emulate Arts and Culture, which was, the whole idea was to make creative writing and creative arts more accessible to any student that wanted to submit. The piece that I ended up submitting to Meridians is called Month of Wind, Mes del Viento, and I ended up writing it during my final semester of undergrad when I was abroad in Argentina, studying social movements and human rights. It was such an incredible experience, and we spent the 4 months traveling around and meeting indigenous leaders, environmental leaders and organizations. And I met Amanca Quintriqueo, who was the first female leader of an indigenous Mapuche community in Patagonia. And I was so blown away by this, by her I don't know, her everything she said. And I was like, I am going to fixate on you for the next 3 months. And it ended up becoming a piece that involves the Mapudungun, which is the Mapuche language, her own oral history, which takes up, which is about half of the piece in total, contextual histories that I had studied with my Argentina professors, environmental and feminist activisms, and legend. I really wanted to center legend and fable as a valid frame of reference to study a culture that has lost so much to colonization, and using that as an academic framework. And that's why I was so drawn to submitting it to Meridians, because I knew that alternative frameworks, alternative histories were so valued. So I'm going to read a section from that. A lesson in Mapudungun, the Mapuche language. El Walmapu, ancestral territory of the indigenous nations of the Mapuche, which crosses the highlands of the Andes. Los Mapuche, people of the land. Mapudungun, language of the land. As Mapuche Lonco and researcher Wenteche Jose Kidel writes, we are not only referring to material land, because that exists in the concept of Puvchi Mapu. Mapu is a term that implies all the dimensions of life within the universe. That is to say, we can understand the cosmos as Mapu. Another word, Winca, los conquistadores of the 19th century. Originally signifying the white race, it stems from the word Inca, referring to a different colonizer, a different empire that once arrived to El Walmapu. El Walmapu is a region spanning the base of the southern hemisphere, extending through parts of Chile and Argentina long before the first Incas invented their territorial delimitations. El Walmapu is not a territory explicitly. Its Aboriginal people now steward only 6% of its terrain. It holds the history of conquest and the modernity of its material exploitation. Private sectors want to convert its mountains to mines of gold and silver, its biodiversity to monoculture forests. How can we conceptualize of a place that once was, that has within it buried an ancient knowledge and collective memory? A Mankai is trying to remember. Pregúntame, Sese. A Mankai and I sink into the verdance around us. She's preoccupied with the idea that no one is documenting this period of great restoration, and histories are disappearing just as they did with her grandfather. Can she describe the moment she met her family, saw her land? But she can't tell me of her homecoming. She's lost it all to memory. Quote, you recreate it like a fable. What I am proposing to you is that you also give yourself the audacity to interpret it as you would have imagined it. I trust you. End quote. Kume Felen, in Mapuche Cosmovision, proposes an alternative way of life to the capitalist system. It does not contain territorial exploitation, cultural devastation, or spiritual eviction. No hyperconsumption and overproduction and materialism. This way of life asks for the restoration of equilibrium. It suggests the ability to understand ourselves as inseparable from nature, as well as our own capacity for agricultural self-sustenance. The delicate web of nature is revived, love's gentle balance centralized. It feels like home without property, like a great return of environmental consonance. It is how El Walmapu once looked, long before any Wincas. It is the talk-talk, talk-talk of the heartbeat of the world made tranquil again. That is how her homecoming felt to me. And I think one more thing that I'd like to add, thank you, is in terms of my US citizenship and my identity as like a white person, I was every moment I was engaging with this piece, I was thinking about my own epistemological vigilance. Where did I fall within it? How do I tell a story that's not my own? And from that came such like just like that hyper awareness really helped for me to unfold the story. And I specifically remember talking with a Mankai, and she would tell me sacred details about their ceremonies and things like that, and kind of negotiating what was important for my US audience to know, what was sacred and didn't need to be unveiled in order for the community to be understood and be represented. And that was one of the things I was very focused on. So thank you.
Thank you, Cece. And that actually, I'm going to stay with you for a minute and ask a question that I'm going to ask of each of our panelists. You each appear in different issues, as Asle and Sandra are in the same issue, but and each issue provides a context that I'd like you to reflect on in terms of how your work specifically resonates with that context, with the other pieces of the issue. Now, Cece, you haven't seen the table of contents for your forthcoming issue, but it is one that's focused on indigenous feminisms across the world. So, and it was so coincidental that your piece addressed that topic and offered us a creative writing piece for the issue. But so could I ask you to reflect a little more about that as a context for Mes de Viento? And I understand that you invited some of the folks you worked with in Argentina to join the webinar.
Yes, I invited Amanka Quinchiqueo, but she is exceptionally busy. She couldn't make it. So I think she might tune in for the reading on April 19th.
Which will happen. Thank you for reminding me of that. Cece will also be our Meridian's prose winner in residence in the fall and be doing a reading, in the spring right now, this coming month in April here at the Poetry Center as well. But yes, go on, Cece.
Yeah, during my studies in Argentina, one of my main focuses was, as much as I could, releasing the Western cosmovision that I had existed in since birth. And really embracing, the moment that I read the Kume Felen, alternative means of existence that had never been accessible to me. And I think that context is so important for understanding also the web between indigenous, feminist, and environmental. There's a very strong tejido, as they call it, this knitted power between these three separate movements that's coming together so well because of these cosmovisions, where the Negen, the spirits within the mountains and the water and the sky in Mapudungun, are also a reason to protect environmentalism just for itself, because they are also feeling in the same way we as humans are. So it's not just a humanist prospect, but more than that. And I think that, I was trying to dive into this cosmovision so fully, but also knowing I would never fully understand it, right? And so where does that take us in terms of my own narrative voice? Just embracing the inexpertise of my own, stumbling through it with the reader, and we're learning together, and then having the two expert voices of Florencia Yaniesho, who was my academic advisor and a researcher and journalist involving social environmental movements across Patagonia, and then also Amankai. And the moments where I was staying with them for 3 days, and coincidentally enough, it was the 3 days where they had their historic reclamation of the land, and they were officially recognized by the government for the first time since colonization began in the 1800s.
What a wonderful opportunity to be a witness to history, Cece. I'm going to ask the same question of Jay. Your piece is in the Black feminisms in the Caribbean and the US. How does that context resonate for your work? And that's this issue here. I think I shared it already.
Yeah, great cover. I was just, re-looking at all the articles in that one and just really thinking about the extremes, I guess, of Black life globally, and thinking how we can have both emotional as well as a political response to all of that, and still, even decades after enslavement and colonization, as these processes are still continuing, how we all still have to find our location despite the standards and normative discussions of our lives. And I remember being in the other conversation we had earlier this year with the other issue on mourning, and being like, we've been forced into mourning, but then how do we as Black scholars, as women, as femmes, as people of color in general, both understand these emotions that we are forced to do, as well as accept the emotions that make us ourselves and make us true in the world. And so that kind of tension, I guess, is also where I definitely fall in myself, of Black girl magic is supposed to be about joy and winning, but if that's not what you want to do, then how do we have a language to not fall into the kind of forced grief, but accept a sadness, a depression, a ugliness, an abject feeling, and still claim that as us. And so definitely feeling the tension, as I'm going to repeat that word, and fitting within everyone else's narratives is really, I guess, where I center my work, as well as how that issue kind of feels with the broader scope of Black feminism.
Yeah. Thank you. And, Jay, as you were speaking, you reminded me of Jose Esteban Muñoz's work on feeling brown and the central role of melancholy, right? And disidentification, which is going to bring me to Sandra as a sister Latino studies person, to ask you the same question about the context of the issue on feminist mornings, which was so beautifully curated by Jyoti and Kimberly. And here it is for folks to reflect on that context. And Ashley, I'll ask you at the same time. So perhaps the two of you can just kind of riff back and forth a bit, since you are neighbors in that issue. Sandra?
Thank you so much for that. And for everyone else in sharing their beautiful work. But the piece, I really tried to think about what the editors were excited about in the kind of emancipatory pathways that mourning allows for. And I think in this piece in particular, and at least in the book that's forthcoming, I'm really trying to think about not replicating the mourning melancholia debate, but to think about grief, not only as it pertains to performances on stage, but in everyday life, or to simply ask, what is the full sensorial landscape of grief, and where do we find ourselves? So, like, if grief is this relentless endeavor to recount and maybe re-encounter the lost subject, object, how do we become these stabled instabilities that belong to time's clemency? If we're thrown into suffering without specific distance and consistently realigned non-normally, then the process has to require us to surrender to time itself, as the phases of grieving are anything but successive. And so interested in how this intentional labor of grief and its immaterial conduits work, I really want to think about a grief as an entry and an exit, a way forward and a way past. An entwined enterprise between the singular and communal sorrow, or what does it mean to offer a tear for a tear, given and taken in an ensemble of entanglements that occur outside of colonial mandates. And in this case specifically, I turn to my training, which is to think about minoritarian aesthetics as an avenue for something better in the here and now, or something that has yet to appear in the training and in the love that I have for my beloved mentor, Jose Esteban Muñoz. So thank you.
I wanted to also elaborate on the organs and senses that participate in rituals and practices of mourning with this piece. In other words, I was mostly interested in the sensuality of embodied forms of mourning, which is a key feminist issue for me. And also it's an attempt to develop a feminist approach to mourning. But I also wanted to queer and trans this feminist approach to mourning. So I wanted to center the sense of touch and tactility as a generative force in exploring alternative ways of mourning and grief. This tactile domain where life and death meets and interacts and renders the deceased body intelligible and meaningful, and it generates a sensorial room for recognition, love, care, and grief. Here in this particular terrain, touching becomes mourning. Touching is mourning. But it's also important to think about the limits and the regulations of this tactile intimacy with the dead, which I mean, who can touch, how one can touch. These are all regulated by blood family regimes and sexuality and gender regimes in Turkey. So it is also important to recognize the gender thresholds of this mourning space and to contest this particular space, the limits of mourning. So then comes the queer feminist, trans feminist approach to mourning itself. So it was a perfect fit actually for this special issue on feminist mournings.
Thank you, Asli. And Yeli, last but not least, touch can often be so transgressive when it comes to Black women's hair. And yet your piece lands on this question of haptic grace. So I'd like to ask you to think about, again, that reflection in the context. You also have not seen the table of contents for the mosaic issue. We'll send it to you because I just finalized it. But there is a resonance between your piece, as I said, and these other pieces in the issue. But could you reflect for a minute about this question of haptic grace for us?
Yes, thanks for that question. I've been thinking a lot about that. And I think that for me, one thing that haptic grace is, it's this is literally the opposite of a blues song. This is an instance as a Black woman where it was fine for someone to touch my hair. And I don't mention the race of the person that touched my hair because the moment was bigger than race for me. And the exchange of care was bigger than that for me. And also some things need to be kept out of homes for suspense and mystery purposes. But in terms of thinking about what haptic grace means to me, I think it's a physical, kind, attentive, and nonverbal exchange of generosity. And so I think when we're thinking about haptic grace, when I think about it too, one of the features of that word to me is, or that phrase to me is something that is momentary. And I think there's an element of surprise in it. And how can we dignify and illuminate each other at a moment's notice in a perfect way? And so that's what I think haptic grace is. It's something that is quick, fleeting, and memorable, and is worthy of being archived and honored.
And I think that is a beautiful note on which to end our Meridians webinar today, and to thank you all again for the work that you are doing in the world. Thank you for selecting Meridians as a home for that work, for being part of the Meridians Project community. It's really as much an honor for me as editor to have invited you in and to have had you accept that invitation. I hope that everyone who's attending today and those who come back to see the recording will download your work, will read it. If you don't have access for some reason, please write to us at meridians@smith.edu, and we'll happily make sure that you get a copy of these essays, poems, and prose piece. I also almost forgot to mention our 20th anniversary reader, which we published we published it in 2020. It's already been a couple of years, hard to believe, but has a beautiful collection that exemplifies the best of Meridians for its first 17 years. And we also did do a 20th anniversary celebration online, which you can also watch to hear more of our Meridians authors. And as I forget if it was maybe Jay who mentioned it, we have done volume celebrations for the past 3 volumes. It was one of the unexpected but lovely outcomes of the going virtual during the pandemic. And those are all also on our website, so you can hear more Meridian author voices and just be as impressed and as wowed by them as we are. So thank you all again. I wish you all a lovely day, rest of the year.